Meet my nephew, 24 years old, running a tech startup and possessing a nasty habit of using my military service as his opening joke at every single pitch event. My uncle is in the Space Force, he would say to the investors, so basically he is just the government. He actually built his entire regional keynote speech around that exact punchline. He just had absolutely no idea who else was sitting in that room. To understand how that joke triggered a total collapse of everything he thought he knew, I have to go back. My name is David. I am 33 years old and I hold the rank of captain in the United States Space Force. My specialty is space operations. Specifically, I spend my days monitoring satellite telemetry and orbital systems out of a secure facility near Cape Canaveral, Florida. When most people hear the name of my branch, they immediately picture a science fiction movie. They imagine laser blasters and starships. The reality is far drier, deeply technical, and completely invisible to the general public. But it is also the fragile foundation upon which the modern world rests. Every time a cargo ship navigates a storm, every time a bank transfer clears, and every time a local dispatcher relies on a digital map to guide an ambulance to a critically injured patient, they are utilizing an architecture of signals that my unit manages and protects. We do not kick down doors. We do not patrol perimeters with rifles. We sit in highly classified, temperature-controlled rooms running the math that keeps billions of dollars of orbital assets from drifting out of alignment. In our world, we operate on a very specific philosophy. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. We deal exclusively in facts over feelings. The data is the data. You do not guess, and you do not rush because a calculation error of a fraction of a degree means a massive sector of the civilian grid goes completely dark. It is a quiet profession, which means it is easily misunderstood. I am generally very patient with people who do not grasp what I do. Ignorance is just noise. And in space operations, you learn very early how to separate the signal from the noise. My nephew Tyler was completely composed of noise. Tyler was my older sister's son. He was 24 years old, highly educated, and practically radiating with unearned confidence. He had recently dropped out of a graduate degree program to launch a technology startup in Orlando. His company was building a mobile application designed to optimize localized supply chain logistics. After securing a modest round of seed funding from a group of regional venture capitalists, Tyler underwent a complete personality shift. He traded his casual college clothes for expensive designer vests and minimalist sneakers. He began speaking exclusively in Silicon Valley buzzwords, talking endlessly about scaling up disrupting legacy markets and moving fast to break things. In my line of work, if you move fast and break things, people can die. But Tyler existed in the universe where the only metric that mattered was velocity. And somewhere along his rapid ascent, he decided that my career was the perfect foil to highlight his own brilliance. To Tyler, the military was a dinosaur, and the Space Force was not even a real branch. He viewed me not as an officer, but as a low-level bureaucrat hiding behind a camouflage uniform. I was just the slow, bloated, outdated government getting in the way of private sector innovation. He made this abundantly clear at every single family gathering. We would be sitting on my sister's back patio in the sweltering Florida humidity, surrounded by aunts and cousins, and Tyler would hold court. He would talk loudly about his coding sprints and his brilliant engineering team. If someone politely turned and asked me how my week was going at the base, Tyler would jump in before I could answer. "Come on, Uncle David," he would say, his voice dripping with condescension. "You guys just sit at desks filling out paperwork for satellites that were launched 30 years ago. My startup does more actual engineering before lunch than your whole department does all year. You are basically just a glorified hall monitor for the government. You are not real military." My sister would usually just chuckle nervously, looking down at her plate. The rest of the extended family would offer tight, awkward smiles. They were immensely proud of Tyler and his booming business, so they forgave his arrogance as the simple byproduct of youth and ambition. Nobody ever corrected him. I never argued with him either, not because I lacked an answer, but because arguing with an ego that large is a profound waste of energy. You cannot shout a satellite into a stable orbit. You calculate the trajectory, you input the variables, and you wait for gravity to do the heavy lifting. Sometimes you confront disrespect directly. Sometimes you simply let an overconfident person talk until they trap themselves in their own ignorance. I preferred to wait. Tyler mistook my quiet discipline for weakness. He assumed I did not defend my career because he firmly believed he was entirely correct about me. He thought I was just an administrator. He did not know about the shift work. He did not know about the locked rooms, the classified briefings, or the absolute zero margin for error reality of keeping the nation's critical infrastructure online. That fundamental underestimation made him careless. It all came to a head in early autumn. The air around the Florida coast was thick, sticky, and oppressive, signaling the dangerous peak of hurricane season. My sister hosted a Sunday dinner to celebrate a massive milestone for Tyler. His startup had just been selected to present at a major regional technology and innovation showcase. This was a premier event guaranteed to be packed with wealthy investors, state emergency officials, and heavy hitters in the technology corridor. Tyler was slated to deliver a 30-minute keynote address. It was his chance to secure millions of dollars in subsequent funding. He spent the entire dinner vibrating with nervous energy, talking rapidly about his presentation. He told the table he needed a strong opening hook, a narrative device that would instantly highlight his company's agility against the backdrop of institutional waste. He stopped talking and looked directly across the dinner table at me. A slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He reached into the pocket of his tailored shorts and pulled out a heavy cardstock lanyard. The words, "All Access Guest Pass," were printed in bold silver lettering. He casually tossed it across the table. It slid over the polished wood and stopped right next to my water glass. "I want you there, in the front row," Uncle David Tyler said, leaning back and crossing his arms. "It will be a great opportunity for you to see how things actually get built in the private sector." I looked down at the pass, then back up at him. "And I need you there for the speech," he continued, his smirk widening into a grin. I figured out my opening joke. I am using your government job as the ultimate punchline. It is the perfect metaphor for everything wrong with slow, outdated bureaucracy. You do not mind being a prop for the sake of progress, right? Total silence fell over the dining room. My sister stopped chewing. The rest of the family stared at their plates. I did not argue. I simply picked up the pass, folded the lanyard strap, and set it carefully beside my plate. He had his punchline. He just had no idea what was actually coming. The silence at the dinner table lingered just long enough to become deeply uncomfortable. The rest of the family stared at the polished wood, waiting for the inevitable explosion. My sister, forever the dedicated peacemaker, quickly rushed into the quiet void with loud, forced questions about the venue and its catering options. She praised the massive convention center in downtown Orlando, desperate to change the subject. Tyler eagerly took the bait. Denied a fight, he quickly pivoted back to bragging to his mother about the massive valuation he expected his company to hit by the next fiscal quarter. I sat quietly finishing my meal, listening as my nephew casually deconstructed my military service for his own amusement. Over the next 2 weeks, the upcoming Regional Technology Showcase completely dominated every conversation in our extended family. The event transformed my sister's house into Tyler's personal campaign headquarters. Aunts coordinated transportation to the venue. Uncles discussed how to subtly network with angel investors by the coffee stations. And my sister managed an endless stream of tailored suits coming back from the dry cleaners. Tyler was the undisputed center of gravity, and he was reveling in the pull of his own orbit. Whenever I stopped by the house after finishing a grueling shift at the operations floor, Tyler was usually pacing in the living room. He treated our family gatherings like a captive test audience for his material. His core argument was that municipal supply chains and local delivery networks were hopelessly bogged down by legacy systems. His software application, he claimed, was the agile private sector cure. To emphasize this point, he had developed a recurring bit. He would contrast the blazing speed of his software updates with the perceived stagnation of a government employee, specifically an officer in the Space Force. It is exactly like my Uncle David Tyler would announce loudly into an imaginary microphone, pacing back and forth across the living room rug. He is a captain in the Space Force, which sounds incredible, right? You picture him commanding a star cruiser, but then you realize he just works for the government. He would pause for dramatic effect, letting a small scoff escape his lips. Yes, the government, Tyler would repeat. They put a fancy uniform on him and let him pretend he is defending the galaxy. But if his office needs to order a new computer mouse, he probably has to fill out 30 pages of requisition forms in triplicate and wait 6 months for a committee to approve it. Meanwhile, my engineering team spun up a custom logistics algorithm over a single weekend. That is the fundamental difference between real innovation and government stagnation. My sister would offer a weary sigh, usually throwing a weak, apologetic glance in my direction. "David, you know how he gets when he is stressed," she would say softly, offering me a fresh cup of coffee. "He does not mean any harm by it. He is just trying to tighten up his presentation." I took the coffee. I did not take the bait. If you have ever had to bite your tongue while someone who knew absolutely nothing about your profession confidently explained it to you, tell me how you handled it in the comments. For me, I leaned on my training. In military logistics and space operations, you are trained to constantly assess the operating environment. You identify threats, you monitor variables, and you ignore irrelevant friction. Tyler was irrelevant friction. Arguing with him would accomplish nothing. If I raised my voice, if I demanded respect, I would only prove his central thesis. I would just be the angry, inflexible government bureaucrat, entirely devoid of a sense of humor. So I offered a calm, level gaze. Facts over feelings. "That sounds like a very efficient algorithm, Tyler," I would say, simply taking a sip of the dark roast. "I hope it performs well under pressure." He would roll his eyes, visibly annoyed that I refused to engage in a shouting match, and then pivot back to boasting about the investors who had reserved seats for his session. The primary target of all this grandstanding, Tyler revealed one afternoon, was not just the venture capitalists. The event organizers had secured a major regional figure to finish out the showcase, a special guest speaker who was deeply connected to both federal infrastructure grants and state emergency logistics. Tyler was desperate to impress this specific individual. He was convinced that if his mobile application could catch this official's attention, he could lock down a massive municipal contract for emergency supply routing. "If I can make him laugh with that opening bit about your desk job," Uncle David Tyler said, pointing a finger at me across the kitchen island, "I own the room. That joke is going to be the icebreaker that lands me a contract worth millions of dollars." He deals with government red tape all day long. He is going to absolutely love it. He was so certain. He was so entirely convinced that the entire world operated exactly the way he imagined it did. He thought my uniform was a costume, a relic of an outdated system that existed only to shuffle paper. He looked at me and saw a man who had never done a day of real engineering in his life. It was a profound blind spot, not just for Tyler, but for my entire family. They truly believed I sat safely at a desk playing with spreadsheets and drinking bad coffee. They believed Tyler's assessment because they simply did not possess the clearance to know the truth. They did not understand that when his mobile application queried a network for a location pin, it was bouncing a signal off a constellation of hardware that my team actively monitored, maintained, and protected from solar radiation, orbital debris, and deliberate signal jamming. Tyler was building the roof and mocking the people holding up the foundation. As the showcase drew to within 48 hours, the atmosphere in my sister's house reached a fever pitch. Tyler was finalizing his slide deck, pacing the floors, snapping at his cousins if they made too much noise. I had stopped by to drop off a tool my brother-in-law had asked to borrow. Tyler barely looked up from his glowing laptop screen as I walked through the hallway. "Make sure your dress uniform is pressed for Friday," Uncle David Tyler called out, his voice sharp and distracted. "I need the visual contrast, the slow, outdated military guy in the front row, right before I reveal the fastest commercial logistics application on the market. Do not let me down." I paused near the front door. "I will be there, Tyler," I replied quietly. I left the house and drove the long, flat stretch of highway back toward the coast. The late afternoon sun beat down on the dashboard, the humidity already beginning to build ahead of the evening storms. I pulled into the driveway of my small house, parked the car, and walked inside. My home was quiet. It was sparse, organized, and deeply silent. I walked into my bedroom and opened the closet. My service dress uniform hung neatly in a protective garment bag. I unzipped the nylon cover, the faint smell of dry cleaning chemicals filling the small space. I brushed a piece of lint from the dark blue fabric, my fingers grazing the silver insignia pinned to the lapel. Tyler thought I sat safely at a desk, playing with spreadsheets. He thought my world was slow. As I stared at the uniform, the quiet of my bedroom faded away. My mind drifted back to the previous autumn, back to a windowless, heavily fortified operations floor at the base, back to the blinding glow of the telemetry monitors, the frantic, hushed voices of my command team, and the sheer, exhausting terror of a timeline measured entirely in seconds. The previous autumn had been brutal. The state of Florida is no stranger to severe weather, but the storm that formed late that September was a monster. It rapidly intensified into a Category 3 hurricane in the unusually warm waters of the Atlantic, and its projected path aimed straight for the densely populated central corridor of the state. As the outer bands began lashing the coastline, the civilian infrastructure braced for impact. At my secure facility, we were not worried about the wind ripping the roof off. Our building was designed to withstand a direct hit. Our primary concern was what was happening roughly 22,000 miles above the atmosphere. When a major natural disaster strikes, modern emergency response relies entirely on a delicate orbital architecture. The ambulances, the rescue helicopters, the police dispatch centers, and the state emergency management hubs all depend on constant, uninterrupted satellite communications and global positioning signals. If those signals degrade, a dispatcher cannot route an ambulance to a flooded nursing home. A rescue helicopter cannot pinpoint a family trapped on a roof. The chaos on the ground is terrifying. But if the signal drops entirely, the chaos becomes lethal. That night, my team and I were locked into the operations floor. The room was bathed in the cool blue glow of massive display screens tracking orbital telemetry and global weather patterns. As the hurricane made landfall, the sheer volume of atmospheric interference began aggressively degrading the primary satellite constellation serving our sector. The emergency signal strength was plummeting. The regional grid was starting to fracture. If you have never worked in a crisis center, there is a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when things begin to fail. Not the loud panic of a television drama, because in a real crisis, panic wastes time. It is a suffocating, focused dread. The command module was silent, except for the frantic clicking of keyboards and the low hum of the ventilation system. "Captain, we are losing the link to the primary emergency dispatch node," my senior technician reported, his voice tight. "Signal degradation is at 40% and climbing. They are going to lose communication with their first responders in less than 12 minutes. 12 minutes. That was all the time we had before 400,000 people were cut off from emergency services in the middle of a catastrophic storm. The standard operating procedure in that scenario dictates a slow, calculated shift of secondary assets to boost the signal. But we did not have time for standard operating procedure. We needed a brute force solution. Sometimes you rely on automated systems to correct a decaying orbit. Sometimes you have to take the controls and fly the satellite yourself. We had a secondary constellation of legacy communication satellites in a slightly higher orbit. Repositioning them to cover the dead zone required complex mathematical calculations to account for orbital drift and fuel consumption. If I authorized a maneuver and miscalculated the trajectory by a fraction of a degree, I would permanently misalign the satellites and burn through years of their operational lifespan in minutes. I would cripple a multi-million-dollar government asset. It was a massive risk, but on the ground, emergency workers were losing their maps, their radios, and their lifelines. "Calculate the burn for the legacy constellation," I ordered, leaning over the console. "We are going to drift them 3 degrees into a temporary supporting orbit and force a direct relay to the local nodes." "Sir," the technician hesitated. "The fuel expenditure on those legacy birds will be massive, and the math for a maneuver that aggressive will take hours to verify." "We do not have hours," I replied, my eyes locked on the degrading signal bars. I will run the telemetry math manually, reroute the command interface to my terminal. For the next 10 minutes, I did not exist outside of those numbers. The air in the room felt thick. My heart hammered against my ribs as I rapidly calculated thrust vectors, orbital mechanics, and fuel flow rates. I typed lines of command code, bypassing the automated safety protocols that usually governed the aging hardware. It was raw, terrifying engineering, performed at the absolute limit of my capability. Tyler thought his weekend coding sprints were stressful. He had never had to write a command script, knowing that if his code failed, a rescue crew on the ground would drive blindly into floodwaters. Execute the burn I commanded. We watched the telemetry screen. In the cold vacuum of space, thrusters fired. Massive metal structures adjusted their orientation by a fraction of an inch. Slowly, agonizingly, the new signal relay locked in. The degradation stopped. The connection bars stabilized, then began to climb back to full strength. Link restored. The technician exhaled, collapsing back into his chair. Dispatch nodes are confirming full operational status. The grid is holding. We kept them online for the next 72 hours. We worked in rotating shifts, surviving on stale coffee and adrenaline, constantly adjusting the temporary orbit to fight the atmospheric interference until the storm finally broke and passed. When it was over, there were no parades. There were no press conferences. The general public simply assumed their cell phones and dispatch radios continued working because of good luck. In space operations, our greatest successes are the disasters that nobody ever knows happened. A few weeks later, I was called into a joint after-action briefing with state emergency officials. I sat quietly in the back of the room, wearing my uniform, listening as they analyzed the disaster response. At the end of the meeting, the regional emergency management director personally thanked the military liaison team. He noted that the unbroken satellite link was the single most critical factor in their successful rescue operations. Later that week, I received a quiet official commendation letter. It detailed my specific actions during the storm, formally recognizing the successful repositioning maneuver that preserved the regional dispatch capability. It was signed by my commanding officer, but at the very bottom, it also carried the formal endorsement signature of a regional civilian authority. It was the exact same emergency management director from the briefing. I folded the letter, placed it in a secure file at my house, and went back to work. My family never knew. I could not tell them the details, and honestly, they had never asked. I stood in my quiet bedroom, the memory of that frantic night fading as I looked back at the dress uniform hanging in my closet. Tyler thought I was a joke. He was banking on my supposed irrelevance to launch his career. He was about to stand on a stage and mock the very infrastructure that kept his state from collapsing. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. It was an automated email from my sister, enthusiastically forwarding the final itinerary for the Regional Technology Showcase. I picked up the phone. The subject line simply stated, "The big day is finally here," followed by a request to arrive at the convention center early. I tapped the screen and downloaded the attached document, ready to see exactly how Tyler had orchestrated his moment of triumph. The morning of the Regional Technology Showcase arrived with a thick layer of Florida humidity already baking the asphalt. I dressed with deliberate, methodical care. I pulled my service dress uniform from its protective garment bag, the dark blue fabric immaculate and free of lint. I adjusted my pale blue shirt and dark tie, ensuring the silver rank insignia pinned to my collar were perfectly aligned. I brushed a nearly invisible speck of dust from the colorful rows of ribbons resting over my left pocket. Tyler had specifically requested a visual contrast for his presentation. He needed a breathing symbol of what he considered to be slow, outdated government stagnation sitting right in the front row. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I was precisely the visual prop he had demanded. I drove the long stretch of highway toward downtown Orlando. The convention center was a sprawling, modern complex of steel and tinted glass, its massive air conditioning units fighting a losing battle against the rising heat. As I walked through the sliding double doors, the contrast between my daily routine and Tyler's environment was immediate and jarring. The main concourse was a buzzing hive of aggressive networking and caffeinated ambition. The air smelled of roasted espresso and expensive cologne. Young professionals in tailored suits and minimalist designer sneakers moved rapidly between high-top tables, trading heavy cardstock business cards and frantically rehearsing their pitch decks. The digital banners hanging from the soaring ceiling flashed words like disruption, scalability, and agility. I navigated through the dense crowd, drawing a few curious, confused stares. In a room full of people desperate to look innovative and rule-breaking, a fully decorated military officer walking with measured, deliberate steps was a complete anomaly. To them, I was just a slow, underpaid government employee getting in the way of progress. I ignored the stares, keeping my posture straight and my expression perfectly neutral. I found my family clustered near the entrance to the main auditorium. My sister was pacing nervously, adjusting the strap of her purse, while my aunts and uncles huddled together like a protective detail. When she spotted my uniform, she practically ran over and pulled me into a tight embrace. "David, thank you so much for doing this," my sister said, stepping back and smoothing the lapels of my jacket. "Tyler is backstage losing his mind. He is so stressed about this presentation. He said he absolutely needs you sitting right in the center aisle of the front row. It is crucial for his opening joke." I simply offered a polite, calm nod. I walked past my family toward a massive, illuminated digital board that displayed the full itinerary for the day. While most attendees were relying on the digital application on their phones, I have always preferred physical boards or dedicated screens. A hardwired display does not fail because of a bad wireless connection. I scanned the schedule looking for Tyler's specific time slot. He was scheduled for 30 minutes at 10 in the morning. It was a prime window to secure his funding, impress his investors, and achieve his ultimate glory. But as my eyes tracked further down the glowing screen, moving past the afternoon panel discussions, they locked onto the final event of the day. Directly following the afternoon break was the highly anticipated final address from the special guest speaker. The topic was listed as Innovation and Regional Crisis Management. Beneath that title was the name of the keynote speaker. The text stated, "Special Address by Marcus Vance, Regional Director of State Emergency Management." The heavy, ambient noise of the convention center suddenly faded into a distant, muffled hum. I stood perfectly still, my eyes tracing the letters of the name again. It was him. Marcus Vance was the exact emergency management director who had chaired the joint after-action briefing following the hurricane. He was the man who had stood at the front of a secured room and detailed exactly how the Space Force had kept his emergency grid from completely failing during the height of the storm. He was the civilian authority whose signature was currently resting in a locked file cabinet in my house, endorsing my official commendation for the orbital repositioning maneuver. The dramatic irony hit me with the force of a physical blow. For weeks, Tyler had been obsessing over this exact official. He was entirely convinced that mocking a Space Force officer would endear him to a man who supposedly hated government red tape. He believed that using my service as a punchline for institutional incompetence would win him a massive municipal contract. Tyler was completely, catastrophically blind to the reality of the battlefield he was stepping onto. He had built an elaborate, cruel trap, completely unaware that he was standing squarely in the center of the blast radius. I looked down the long carpeted hallway toward the backstage access doors. I possessed the exact intelligence needed to stop the collision. I could walk back there right now, pull my nephew into a quiet green room, and explain exactly who was sitting in the audience. I could tell him about the encrypted telemetry logs, the failing grid, and the direct relay command. I could demand he scrap his opening joke immediately. I could save him from his own arrogant miscalculation. But I thought about the weeks of constant disrespect. I thought about the arrogant smirk across the dinner table. I thought about how he viewed my uniform, not as a symbol of sacrifice, but as a cheap, disposable prop for his own ego. In military operations, you absolutely warn your allies if they are stepping blindly into a hazard. But if a hostile operator aggressively ignores every single warning sign and accelerates willingly into a debris field, you maintain your discipline. You let gravity do the heavy lifting. The data was the data. Tyler had ignored every subtle warning. If I warned him now, he would not learn humility. He would simply change his script to save his own pride, and his fundamental contempt for my service would remain entirely intact. Overconfident operators eventually stop checking their instruments, and when you stop checking your instruments, you crash. Tyler needed to crash. I turned away from the glowing schedule board and offered my sister a calm, reassuring smile. "Let us go find our seats," I said, simply. We filed into the massive, dimly lit auditorium. The room was impressive, designed to seat roughly 800 attendees. The plush velvet rows gently sloped down toward a brightly illuminated minimalist stage. I found my assigned seat in the very front row, directly on the center aisle, exactly as Tyler had requested. My family took their seats beside me, whispering excitedly as the auditorium rapidly filled with wealthy investors, local politicians, and media personnel. I sat perfectly straight. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I was exactly the slow, outdated dinosaur my nephew had requested. I slowly scanned the reserved seating section just a few feet away. There, surrounded by event organizers and municipal aides, sat Marcus Vance. He possessed the serious, unbothered demeanor of a man who dealt with actual life-threatening emergencies, not software startup valuations. He was scrolling through a digital tablet, entirely unaware of my presence, and entirely unaware of the presentation that was about to unfold. The digital clock on the wall counted down to 10. The overhead lights in the sleek auditorium dimmed to total blackness. A hushed anticipation rolled through the massive crowd. A driving, pulsing electronic bass track began to play over the heavy sound system, vibrating through the floorboards. A booming, polished voice echoed through the speakers, introducing the founder of the most exciting logistics platform in the region. Tyler strutted out from the backstage shadows. He held a wireless microphone in his right hand. He looked sharp, projecting the exact image of a modern, disruptive technology executive. He strode confidently to the exact center of the stage, the bright white spotlight following his every move. He paused, soaking in the polite applause from the crowd, his posture radiating absolute certainty. He waited for the applause to die down completely. The massive room went dead silent. Tyler smiled a wide, practiced grin. He raised the microphone to his mouth, ready to begin his presentation, and stared right at me in the front row. Tyler stood in the center of the brightly lit stage, projecting absolute, unshakable confidence. The massive digital screen behind him glowed with the sleek logo of his startup company. 800 wealthy venture capitalists, regional politicians, and technology executives fell silent, waiting for his opening words. Tyler raised the wireless microphone, a perfectly practiced, relaxed smile spreading across his face. "Good morning, everyone," Tyler began, his voice echoing cleanly through the massive space. "We are here today to talk about speed. We are here to talk about true agility and how the private sector is moving faster than legacy institutions ever could." He paused and began a slow, deliberate pace across the stage. "But to understand speed, you have to understand exactly what is holding us back," Tyler continued, projecting a tone of sympathetic amusement. "I want to bring your attention to the front row today. Sitting right there in the center aisle is my Uncle David." 800 heads turned slightly in the darkness. The bright, invasive glare of a secondary spotlight suddenly dropped from the ceiling, washing over my dark blue uniform. I did not shift in my seat. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my face fixed in a neutral, relaxed expression. I simply looked back at my nephew, absorbing the sudden, intense focus of the entire auditorium. Tyler offered a soft, dismissive chuckle into the microphone. "My uncle wears a very impressive uniform," he said. "He is a captain in the United States Space Force. Now, when you hear that title, you probably imagine something incredibly fast and futuristic, right? You picture laser beams and defending the galaxy at the speed of light." A ripple of polite, knowing laughter washed through the front rows. "But the reality is just a little bit different," Tyler said, leaning forward slightly over the edge of the stage as if sharing a secret with the entire room. The reality is that he works for the federal government, and we all know exactly what that means. It means massive, bloated bureaucracy. It means spending 30 days waiting for committee approval just to upgrade a single software patch on a satellite that was probably built during the Cold War. He stopped pacing and turned fully toward the audience, his hands spreading wide in a gesture of exaggerated helplessness. "That is not a personal insult," he clarified quickly, his tone perfectly calibrated to sound reasonable. "It is just the reality of the institution. The military is inherently slow, incredibly inflexible, and totally unequipped to handle the immediate, rapidly shifting demands of modern municipal logistics. If an emergency strikes or a supply chain fractures, they cannot adapt. They just drown in paperwork. They survive entirely on our tax dollars and hope." The laughter was louder this time, mixing with scattered approving applause from the venture capitalists in the middle rows. My sister, sitting directly to my right, stiffened instantly. She shot me a horrified, panicked look, clearly realizing that the joke was far crueler in front of 800 investors than it had been in her living room. The rest of my extended family sat frozen, incredibly uncomfortable smiles plastered on their faces. I did not move. I did not blink. I stared right back at him. If you have ever had someone publicly use you as a stepping stone to elevate their own ego, tell me how you handled it in the comments. For me, it required training. In military operations, you never react to a hostile action until you possess total situational awareness. Anger is a useless metric. The data was the data. The trap was fully set, and the antagonist had just enthusiastically closed the steel jaws directly onto his own leg. I did not need to correct him. I just needed to let the presentation run its course. By contrast, Tyler proclaimed, his voice rising with passionate energy. My engineering team identified a massive routing flaw in a local delivery network on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, we had completely rewritten the algorithm, tested it, and deployed a seamless update that optimized delivery times by 20%. We move fast. The government moves at the speed of a dying dinosaur. We do not form committees. We build solutions. He had landed his punchline flawlessly. He had successfully positioned himself as the brilliant, agile hero by standing firmly on my shoulders and pushing me into the dirt. He thought he had won. He thought the room belonged entirely to him, but from my position in the front row, I subtly shifted my focus down the aisle to the reserved seating section. Marcus Vance was not laughing. The regional director of State Emergency Management had stopped scrolling through his digital tablet the exact moment Tyler mentioned the Space Force. He was now sitting perfectly still, leaning slightly forward in his plush velvet chair. His eyes narrowed behind his reading glasses, tracking from Tyler on the stage to my uniform in the front row. A deep, heavy frown settled onto his face as Tyler mocked the idea of military stagnation. Vance knew exactly what an actual failure of municipal logistics looked like, and he knew exactly who had kept his region from experiencing it. Tyler, entirely oblivious to the silent shift happening just 30 feet away from him, launched confidently into the remainder of his presentation. For the next 25 minutes, he clicked through bright, colorful digital slides. He boasted about market scalability, cloud architecture, and disrupting legacy supply chains. He promised the audience that his software was the ultimate private sector cure for public sector incompetence. He even circled back to his opening joke twice more, driving the point home by reminding the investors that while the military was busy filling out forms, his team was actively routing delivery trucks with surgical precision. He was charismatic and energetic. He was desperately trying to convince the room that his application was the only thing standing between local government and total logistical failure. He closed his presentation with a dramatic pause and a powerful call to action. The applause that followed was genuinely thunderous. My family clapped enthusiastically, visibly relieved that he had executed his pitch smoothly. Tyler stood center stage, soaking in the validation, his chest puffed out in absolute triumph. He bowed his head slightly, shot one final arrogant smirk in my direction, and practically glided off the side of the stage. The polished event host quickly stepped out from the wings and took the microphone as the applause slowly faded. What a truly incredible presentation on the future of logistics, the host announced, his voice booming over the speakers. I think it is safe to say the future is in very capable hands. Now, to close out our showcase, we have arrived at the highlight of our afternoon. The host gestured toward the reserved section. Our final speaker is a man who manages crises on a scale that most of us can barely comprehend, the host said, projecting absolute respect. He knows more than anyone about the absolute necessity of reliable, functional infrastructure under extreme pressure. Please direct your attention to the stage and join me in welcoming the Regional Director of State Emergency Management, Mr. Marcus Vance, speaking on the topic of innovation that saves lives. The applause for the event host's introduction washed over the massive auditorium. Marcus Vance rose slowly from his velvet seat in the reserved section. He did not possess the caffeinated, frantic energy of a startup founder. He moved with the heavy, deliberate pace of a man who spent his life coordinating disaster relief. He buttoned his dark suit jacket, adjusted his reading glasses, and walked up the side stairs to the brightly illuminated stage. Vance stood behind the clear acrylic podium at the center of the stage. He accepted the wireless microphone from the host and placed a thin manila folder containing his prepared remarks onto the podium. The room grew quiet, waiting for the Regional Emergency Management Director to validate the private sector innovation they had just celebrated. Tyler stood in the wings, just off stage, vibrating with anticipation. Vance slowly opened his manila folder. He looked down at the neatly typed pages of his planned speech. He stared at the words for several long seconds, the silence stretching out until it became incredibly tense. Then, very deliberately, Vance closed the folder. I had prepared a speech today about private sector infrastructure grants. Vance began, his voice deep, unhurried, and carrying absolutely no trace of amusement. But after listening to the previous presentation, I realized that we need to clarify exactly what innovation actually looks like when the stakes are real. When failure is not just a missed quarterly earnings target, but a matter of life and death. A confused murmur rippled through the middle rows of the audience. In the wings, Tyler's confident posture deflated slightly. We heard a lot just now about speed. Vance continued, gripping the edges of the podium. We heard about the agility of rewriting software over a weekend to speed up local deliveries by 20%. And we heard that the military is too bloated and inflexible to manage modern municipal logistics. Vance slowly turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the front row until it locked directly onto me. The room followed his eyes. Once again, 800 people were staring at my dark blue uniform. But this time, the context had violently shifted. The young man who just stood on this stage used a United States Space Force captain as a punchline for government stagnation. Vance said, his voice echoing cleanly off the back walls, hardening like concrete. He assumed that because he builds commercial delivery algorithms, he understands the architecture of crisis management better than the officers holding the grid together. He could not possibly be more wrong. The silence in the auditorium was absolute. My sister gasped softly, pulling her hand to her mouth. In the wings, Tyler stood frozen, the blood rapidly draining from his face as his keynote triumph began to unravel. Vance stepped away from the podium and began a slow pace across the stage. Last autumn, as a Category 3 hurricane made landfall, this state faced a total collapse of emergency communications, Vance stated. If that grid failed, 400,000 people would have been entirely cut off from first responders. Ambulances would have been stranded. Rescue helicopters would have been flying blind in the middle of a catastrophic storm. The automated safety systems on our critical satellites were failing under extreme atmospheric interference. Vance stopped pacing and pointed directly at my family in the front row. To the family members sitting right here and to every investor in this room, Vance announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. While your nephew's app was still in beta, this officer kept dispatch hospitals and emergency global positioning systems online for 400,000 people during a Category 3 landfall. I would call that real innovation. My extended family sat paralyzed in their plush velvet seats, staring at me in absolute shock. The slow, boring bureaucrat they had mocked all month was suddenly revealed as the operational linchpin of a regional crisis response. Near the media section, a uniformed Space Force major stood up. She was our regional public affairs liaison, and she offered a crisp, affirming nod to the emergency director, publicly confirming the official military record of the event. That is the absolute opposite of stagnation, Vance concluded, returning to the podium. That is the kind of quiet, disciplined engineering that actually keeps this country running when everything else fails. Captain, your commendation remains fully endorsed by my office. And to everyone else in this room, if you are looking for true innovation, I suggest you learn the difference between speeding up a delivery truck and holding the sky in place when the wind tries to tear it down. Vance offered a short nod in my direction, ignored his folder entirely, and walked steadily off the opposite side of the stage. The silence held for 3 agonizing seconds before a wave of spontaneous, deeply respectful applause erupted from the back rows, sweeping rapidly to the front. The room was not clapping for my nephew's software. They were clapping for the reality they had just been exposed to. I simply maintained my calm, rigid posture, returning the nod. The event host quickly rushed the stage to awkwardly conclude the showcase. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the auditorium opened, and the crowd surged out into the main concourse. I bypassed the eager networking crowds and walked directly toward the backstage access doors. I found Tyler standing alone near the empty green room. He looked incredibly small. His tailored suit seemed slightly too large for him. The arrogant, untouchable startup founder from 30 minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by a 24-year-old kid who had just crashed heavily into reality. He slowly looked up as I approached. He braced himself, clearly expecting me to demand a loud apology or to rub his public defeat in his face. I stopped a few feet away from him. "Your presentation was structurally very sound, Tyler," I said quietly, my tone perfectly level. "The user interface on your application looks incredibly clean." Tyler blinked, completely thrown off balance. "What?" he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Uncle David? I had absolutely no idea. I thought you just pushed papers." "I know exactly what you thought," I replied, holding up a single hand to stop him. "In operations, we calculate vectors. We look at where an object is heading, and we adjust. You calculated wrong today because you did not check your variables. You assumed that because a system is quiet, it must be slow." I took a step closer, ensuring my voice was low enough that only he could hear it. "But your algorithm for local delivery routing is genuinely impressive," I continued smoothly. "The problem is you are relying entirely on commercial global positioning data that degrades under heavy municipal interference. If you want to talk about integrating military telemetry stabilization into your supply chain tracking, let me know. We could probably optimize your delivery window by another 10%. Tyler stared at me, his eyes wide, struggling to process the fact that I was offering him a lifeline instead of a fatal blow. He swallowed hard, the last remnants of his ego finally evaporating. "Yes, sir," he choked out quietly. "I would really appreciate that. I am so sorry." I gave him a brief nod and walked out of the green room, stepping out into the blinding heat of the Florida afternoon. Not every betrayal requires a loud, explosive payback. Sometimes, the most devastating form of justice is simply letting the truth speak entirely for itself. Anger burns out quickly, but the cold, hard weight of a fact hitting the floor changes a room forever. Over the next 6 months, Tyler and I quietly collaborated on a feature integrating orbital data into his startup's software. He permanently dropped the joke, and he learned the hardest lesson of his career. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the one holding up the ceiling. Is saying the Space Force is not real military a fair jab or genuinely disrespectful? Tell me your take below. Subscribe for more stories where the quiet ones run the infrastructure. I will have a new one for you very soon.